One of the most dangerous toys ever sold to children was marketed as a science kit, and it actually included uranium. It was packaged as educational, but what came inside would raise serious alarms today. The 1960s, a time when toys were as thrilling as they were daring. Back then, safety was more of a suggestion than a rule, and parents rarely batted an eye at what we played with. It was an era where adventure came in a cardboard box, and danger was just part of the fun. If you grew up in the 60s, you probably remember toys that, by today's standards, would make modern safety inspectors gasp. So let's take a look back at some of the most dangerous toys we loved back then. If any of these sound familiar, you may find yourself smiling, or maybe even wincing a little. Wood-burning sets. This wasn't just arts and crafts, it was firepower in a box. Wood-burning sets let kids use an electrically heated pen to carve, scorch, and etch designs into wood, leather, and even plastic. No child-proof switches, no heat guards, just a glowing metal tip hot enough to fry a fingertip. They were sold as creative tools to encourage craftsmanship, but more than a few kids ended up branding their desks, or themselves. First-degree burns aside, these kits were wildly popular in the 60s and 70s. It was hands-on learning at its most literal. Because nothing says DIY like giving a 10-year-old a miniature branding iron. The original creepy crawlers. If you had a creepy crawlers kit back in the day, you know just how magical, and a little dangerous, it felt to whip up your own batch of rubbery, wiggly bugs. Using Plastigoop and metal molds, we'd pour the goo into creepy shapes and set them onto a blazing hot plate that reached over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Minor burns were practically a rite of passage, but showing off those squishy, realistic bugs? Totally worth it. They clung to everything: shirts, couches, even the dashboard of Dad's car. These kits involved hot plates and molten plastic, and while they were beloved for their creativity, they caused frequent burns. Interestingly, they were never officially recalled, but later versions were redesigned with much safer heating mechanisms to better protect tiny hands. Safety, it seems, eventually caught up with our imagination. The Atomic Energy Lab Kit. Yes, it's true. Kids in the 1960s were given real radioactive materials to play with, courtesy of the Atomic Energy Lab Kit. Marketed as a hands-on way to explore nuclear science, it came complete with a Geiger counter, cloud chamber, and tiny samples of uranium ore. It made young science enthusiasts feel like real atomic pioneers, but it also made a lot of parents sweat. The kit included actual radioactive elements, and unsurprisingly, it was only sold for a short time due to growing safety concerns and public outcry. Today, it's universally considered one of the most dangerous toys ever made, and one of the most outrageous examples of how far toy companies were willing to go in the name of educational fun. Lawn darts, also known as jarts. Nothing screamed summer fun like a game of lawn darts in the backyard. These weren't the soft, safe versions you might see today. Jarts were hefty steel-tipped missiles that we tossed high into the air, hoping they'd land point first in the ring and not in someone's leg. Scraped knees and near misses just added to the thrill. But the risks were real. Jarts caused multiple injuries and even several fatalities over the years. The danger became so serious that they were eventually banned by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1988, sparking one of the strongest consumer safety movements in toy history. Still, if you were a kid in the 60s, you probably remember begging the adults to let you take a turn. The Vacuform. The Vacuform was a hands-on dream machine for young inventors in the 1960s. With a sheet of thin plastic, a mold, and a heat source hot enough to sizzle skin, kids could shape miniature cars, planes, or wild creations straight from their imaginations. The smell of melting plastic filled the room, and probably a few lungs. Sure, minor burns and the occasional plastic puddle were part of the experience, but those handmade treasures felt like works of art. Fun fact, the Vacuform was inspired by industrial vacuum forming machines used in manufacturing, only this one sat right on your kitchen table. The slip and slide. There was no better way to beat the summer heat than launching yourself full speed down a bright yellow slip and slide. Just unroll it on the lawn, crank the hose, and dive in. Of course, if the end met a patch of dry grass, or worse, a rock, you were in for a painful surprise. Bruises, scrapes, and waterlogged clothes were the norm, but we kept coming back for that glorious backyard adrenaline rush. Here's a kicker. The slip and slide was invented by accident in 1960 by a dad who just wanted to cool off his driveway for his son. The Easy Bake Oven. For countless kids, the Easy Bake Oven was a ticket to culinary independence. You'd mix up a tiny batch of batter, slide it into that little pink oven, and bake it with nothing but the heat from a glowing 100-watt light bulb. But make no mistake, those metal parts got hot, and burned fingers weren't uncommon. Still, watching your cake rise through that tiny window felt like magic. The best part? That sweet, sugary smell filling the room. A fun fact, more than 30 million Easy Bake ovens have been sold since its debut in 1963, making it one of the most iconic toys of all time. Clackers, also known as click-clacks. Clackers were the soundtrack of many 60s playgrounds. Two acrylic balls connected by a string that kids would swing with perfect timing to make them slam together with a satisfying clack-clack. But when things went wrong, and they often did, those hard plastic balls could snap loose and go flying. Bruised knuckles, sore wrists, and a few broken lamps were just part of the deal. Despite warnings from parents, and even school bans in some places, kids couldn't resist the rhythmic thrill. Fun fact, clackers were eventually pulled from shelves after injuries mounted, but not before they became one of the decade's most memorable fads, Johnny Reb Cannon. What kid didn't want to command their own artillery? The Johnny Reb Cannon was a plastic battlefield dream, complete with a crank mechanism that launched hard plastic cannonballs across the yard. It looked and sounded like the real deal, which was exactly what made it so appealing and so dangerous. A misfired shot could knock over toys, vases, or unlucky siblings, but that didn't stop us from staging elaborate backyard battles. Interestingly, the toy was part of a wave of Civil War-themed playsets popular in the early 60s, long before safety regulations caught up. The Water Wiggle. The Water Wiggle was pure chaotic energy on a garden hose. Once the water started flowing, the attached nozzle sprang to life, dancing, spinning, and whipping around unpredictably, spraying anything and anyone within range. It was wild fun, until it smacked you in the leg or tangled around your arm. Still, it was a hit during summer break. A lesser-known fact, after multiple injuries, the Water Wiggle was recalled in the late 70s. But if you had one in the 60s, chances are it made your backyard feel like a water park run by a madman. Super elastic bubble plastic. Super elastic bubble plastic wasn't your run-of-the-mill bubble mix. It was like science fiction in a tube. We'd squeeze out a dab of colorful goo, roll it into a bubble with a tiny straw, and blow massive shimmering bubbles that floated far longer than anything soap could manage. But those fumes? Potent. More than a few of us got dizzy from the chemical scent, but we kept blowing bubbles anyway, mesmerized by their size and stretch. The formula was made from polyvinyl acetate dissolved in acetone and ethanol, highly flammable and toxic when inhaled. Over time, the product was linked to health concerns and eventually removed from store shelves. But back then, we were too busy making the biggest bubble possible to notice. Sky dancers. Though they made their debut in the early 90s, sky dancers became instant legends and still hold a place in many childhood memories. With a quick pull of the string, these winged dolls would launch into the air, spinning and soaring unpredictably. They were dazzling to watch, until one veered off and clocked someone in the head. It was all part of the magic and mayhem. Believe it or not, over 150 injuries were reported before they were eventually pulled from store shelves. Still, if you ever watched one spin straight into a tree, you probably remember it with a smile. The Whammo Air Blaster. The Whammo Air Blaster looked like a toy ray gun, but it packed a surprisingly powerful punch of air. With a trigger squeeze, it could knock over cups, scatter papers, or zap your friend in the face from across the room. It felt like a superpower in plastic form. While it wasn't exactly dangerous, it could sting if fired too close, especially if you weren't expecting it. Fun fact, the air blaster was so precise, it could hit targets from over 20 feet away, making it a must-have for pretend battles and science experiments alike. Thingmaker. The Thingmaker was like a mini toy factory in a box. With metal molds and colorful bottles of Plasti-Goop, kids could pour, cook, and peel out their own creepy-crawly creations, bugs, monsters, and more. But those metal molds, they got seriously hot. Singed fingers were common, but creating your own toys from scratch felt like magic. Fun fact, the original Thingmaker line debuted in the early 60s under the name Creepy Crawlers, and it became so popular that Mattel released multiple spin-offs, from Fright Factory to Incredible Edibles. Fanner 50 Cap Guns. If you ever wanted to feel like a cowboy straight out of a Saturday morning western, the Fanner 50 Cap Gun was your sidekick. Load it with paper cap rolls, fan the hammer, and let out a satisfying pop with each shot. It was loud, it smelled like gunpowder, and sometimes those caps left tiny burns on your fingers. But none of that mattered. You were the fastest draw in the neighborhood. Here's something cool. The Fanner 50 was modeled after real Colt revolvers and became one of the best-selling toy guns of the 1950s and 60s. Few toys were as oddly hypnotic or downright creepy as the Jolly Chimp. Wind him up and he'd clash his cymbals together while baring his teeth in a fixed, eerie grin. He wasn't particularly dangerous, but his jerky movements and loud clanging could give unsuspecting kids quite the scare. Despite the jump scares, he became an iconic toy of the time. And here's a spooky little fact. The Jolly Chimp has made appearances in several horror movies and TV shows, often playing the role of a haunted or possessed toy, the hippity hop ball. If you had a hippity hop ball, you knew the joy of bouncing around the yard like a wild kangaroo. This oversized rubber ball came with a sturdy handle on top, letting kids hold tight as they bounced, bobbed, and toppled their way to pure joy. Falling off was practically guaranteed, but that didn't stop us. Fun fact, the original hippity hop was invented in Italy in 1968 and quickly became a global sensation, even inspiring adult versions for fitness training decades later. Metal-tipped arrows for archery sets. Before foam-tipped arrows became the norm, kids in the 60s practiced their aim with real metal-tipped arrows. It felt thrilling to draw the bow and imagine yourself as Robin Hood, even if the targets were often improvised and sometimes moving. Of course, a stray shot could turn playtime into a trip to the ER, but back then, a little risk was just part of the fun. These sets were sold in department stores without much warning. Just a box, a bow, and the great outdoors. Belt-buckle derringers. The 1960s were a golden age for Western-themed toys, and the belt-buckle derringer fit right into that wild frontier fantasy. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary belt buckle, but with the press of a hidden button, it would spring open and fire a small plastic bullet. The element of surprise was everything. Whether you were pretending to be a cowboy or a secret agent, of course, a poorly aimed shot could leave a mark or two. Fun fact, these novelty weapons were inspired by real-life hidden guns from the Old West, though thankfully the toy version packed far less firepower. Looking back, it's wild to think about the toys we played with in the 60s. Sure, some of them were downright dangerous, but they also gave us memories we'll never forget. It was a different time when a little risk just came with the fun. Now we want to hear from you. Were you ever in a close call with one of these toys? Maybe you dodged a lawn dart, got tangled in the water wiggle, or took a Super Ball to the face? And did we miss any dangerously fun toys from your childhood? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories. And if this trip down memory lane brought back some good or slightly bruised memories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more nostalgic content just like this.